I'm Captain Mila Black, 32 years old. That morning, my mother didn't look at me like a daughter coming home, but like a stain she needed to hide. She threw a blue silk dress on the bed and ordered me to strip off my uniform for my brother's wedding. She hissed that her in-laws were elite, and the military was just poor trash. She wanted me to wear that dress and become a silent, invisible shadow. I had kept quiet for years, but standing in that room, I finally understood the truth I'd been avoiding. The final line had snapped. What happened when I walked through those ballroom doors that day is something I'll carry for the rest of my life. Welcome to Noble Revenge, where hypocritical masks are crushed by dead silence. If you've ever been trampled by your own flesh and blood, drop a comment with where you're listening from, hit like, and subscribe. Because the moment I pushed those doors open, the entire order changed forever. Let me tell you from the beginning. The rattling cab dropped me off at the end of the driveway. Weston, Massachusetts. A neighborhood where the lawns were cut with rulers and the driveways smelled like fresh asphalt. I hauled my faded canvas duffel bag out of the trunk. It was heavy, packed tight with everything I owned. I walked up the winding brick path to the front door. I turned the brass handle. It wasn't locked. I pushed the heavy oak door open. Silence. No one came running to the foyer. No one yelled my name. I dropped my bag onto the polished hardwood floor. The thud felt entirely too loud for this house. The air hit my face thick with the smell of expensive artificial lemon floor wax. It was a desperate, choking scent, a middle-class attempt to smell like old money. I stood there in my scuffed boots, the fabric of my green jacket stiff with dust and travel. Above my head, the air conditioning vent rattled. A voice echoed down through the metal grate. My mother, Evelyn. "Take those boots and hide them in the garage right now," she snapped. Her voice was sharp, panicked. "If the Whitfields come over early, I am not having that trash sitting in my entryway. Do you hear me?" I didn't yell up to her. I didn't call out to say I was home. I just stood there breathing in the fake lemon scent. My eyes drifted to the mahogany console table against the wall. Sitting on top of it were 3 massive glass vases overflowing with pale pink peonies. Outrageous. Thousands of dollars worth of imported flowers. Paid for with the wire transfer I sent her 3 weeks ago. Money I scraped together eating out of plastic bags, sleeping on dirt floors halfway across the world. Sweating through my clothes so they could have a nice party. I gripped the rough canvas handle of my bag and took the stairs. I walked down the long hallway, heading straight for the last door on the right. My room. I grabbed the knob. It stuck. I had to plant my shoulder against the wood and shove. The door popped open. I stopped in the doorway, my jaw clamped shut. There was no bed. The old oak desk was gone. The posters, the bookshelves, the faded rug. Gone. The entire space had been gutted, replaced by endless rows of rolling metal clothing racks. Stacks of velvet gift boxes tied with silk ribbons filled the corners. Heavy black garment bags holding Wes's custom wedding suits hung from the closet frame. The room I grew up in had been erased, scrubbed clean, turned into a storage closet for a one-day party. My existence in this house was completely wiped out. I took a step backward and pulled the door shut with a soft click. I dropped my bag against the hallway wall. I slid down the drywall, sitting flat on the cold hardwood floor. I crossed my legs, back straight, eyes locked on the top of the staircase. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a fit. I just waited in the shadows of the hall. 10 minutes later, ice clinked against glass. Wes came up the stairs. He wore a crisp white button-down, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, holding a rocks glass full of dark bourbon. He stopped at the top step. He saw me sitting on the floor in the dark hallway. No smile, no welcome back. His eyes dragged up and down my faded uniform jacket. A heavy, exhausted sigh escaped his lips. Like I was a stray dog that managed to wander inside. He walked over. He didn't ask about my flight. He didn't ask how I was doing. Instead, he lifted his left arm, shaking his wrist right in front of my face. The hallway light caught the thick, heavy metal. A brand new Rolex. The face was a deep, arrogant blue. 30 grand. The exact amount of the money I wired home to save him from catering debt. The money I bled for was sitting right on his wrist. "Think this works with the tux?" he asked. His voice was thick with a lazy, arrogant drawl. I didn't look at his face. I just stared at the second hand sweeping around the dial. My own hands were resting on my knees. Knuckles' scarred skin dry and cracked. His hands were soft, manicured. "Matches the countdown perfectly," I said. My voice was flat, dead. He blinked, the words flying right over his perfectly styled hair. He rolled his eyes, took a long sip of his bourbon, and walked past me down the hall. Before he reached his room, the heavy double doors of the master suite swung open. Evelyn stepped out. Her hair was sprayed stiff, a helmet of blonde lacquer. A suffocating cloud of heavy floral perfume rolled off her, burning the back of my throat. She stopped. She looked down at me sitting on the floor. Her face tightened into a bitter scowl. She didn't reach down for a hug. She didn't drop to her knees. She held a cheap plastic hanger. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she tossed it. The hanger bounced off my canvas bag. A dark blue silk dress slid off the plastic, pooling onto the floor, stopping inches from my boots. "Take that off," she said. She didn't even look me in the eye. She pointed a finger at my jacket. "You're sitting at table 9, next to the kitchen doors. Do not ruin this day for us." She turned her back. Her heels clicked sharply against the wood before her bedroom door slammed shut. I sat there in the quiet. I looked down at the pile of blue fabric on the floor. I reached out. My rough fingers brushed against the material. It was slippery, ice cold. I closed my fist around it. I squeezed the silk until my knuckles turned stark white. The silk slipped through my fingers. Cold. Slick. I kept my hand closed, feeling the smooth fabric slide against the thick calluses on my palms. It was a suffocating feeling. It felt exactly like the night I got my captain's bars 4 years ago. That night, the auditorium had smelled like heavy floor wax and stale coffee. I stood in my dress uniform, the stiff wool scratching the back of my neck. I looked out at the rows of gray metal folding chairs. Hundreds of families were out there, cheering, holding up cheap plastic cameras, clapping on backs. My row was completely empty, 4 chairs sitting blank under the fluorescent lights. When it was my turn, an older guy with gray hair and 3 rows of ribbons had to step up. He smelled like peppermint gum and old leather. He pinned the silver bars onto my shoulders because there was no one else to do it. Afterward, I walked out into the empty asphalt parking lot. The night air was freezing. I pulled out my phone and dialed the house in Weston. Evelyn picked up on the 4th ring. I could hear the sharp clinking of crystal champagne flutes in the background. A string quartet was playing somewhere in the room. "Mom, it's done. I just got pinned." She let out a sharp, irritated breath. "Not now, Mila. The charity gala is completely packed. The Whitfields are 2 tables over. I just told everyone you're working a corporate desk job over in Geneva. Do not call this number again tonight." Click. Just the dead, hollow hum of the dial tone. I let go of the blue dress in the dark hallway. It dropped back onto my canvas bag like a dead weight. My throat felt like sandpaper. I needed a glass of water. I pushed myself up from the drywall and walked down the stairs. The hardwood creaked under my thick socks. The house was completely silent now. The kind of heavy, expensive silence you only get in neighborhoods where people pay millions of dollars to ignore each other. I walked past the kitchen and stopped in front of the den. Arthur's home office. The heavy wooden door was cracked open. Moonlight spilled through the expensive plantation shutters, cutting across his mahogany desk. Right on the corner of the desk, there was a silver picture frame. It was shoved face down against the wood. I didn't need to flip it over to know whose face was trapped under the glass. It was my grandfather, an old guy who came back from Vietnam with a head full of nightmares and a severe taste for cheap whiskey. He spent his pension on liquor and used a thick leather belt on Evelyn's back whenever the noise in his head got too loud. I leaned against the doorframe, staring at the back of that picture. I understood it. I really did. To Evelyn, a green uniform didn't mean service. It didn't mean honor. It meant a slammed door, a drunken rage, and a bruised jaw. It meant the poverty she spent 30 years trying to scrub off her skin with expensive lemon floor wax and country club memberships. I got it. But understanding someone's damage doesn't give them a free pass to break your ribs. You don't get to take the belt that hit you and wrap it around your own daughter's neck just to make yourself feel safe. A floorboard groaned behind me. I turned my head. Arthur stood at the edge of the kitchen. He was wearing his expensive plaid robe, holding a glass of milk. He froze when he saw me standing in the shadows of the hall. The glass shook just a fraction of an inch in his hand. Guilt flashed across his tired, sagging face, immediately swallowed by his usual pathetic cowardice. He forced a weak, tight-lipped smile. He cleared his throat. "You sleeping all right out here, kid?" he asked. A hollow, stupid question. He knew damn well my room was gutted. He knew his wife threw a dress at my head and banished me to the hallway. He watched it happen. He signed the checks for the velvet boxes sitting where my bed used to be. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. I squared my shoulders, locked my eyes onto his, and let the silence stretch. I didn't blink. I gave him the dead, heavy stare of someone who had seen people bleed out in the dirt. The silence wrapped around his throat. It pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He couldn't take it. His eyes darted to the floor. He shifted his weight, suddenly fascinated by the grout lines in the tile. "Right. Well, big day tomorrow," he muttered to the floor. He turned around and shuffled quickly back to the master bedroom. The door clicked shut, the lock engaged, the enabler hiding in the dark while his kids slept on the floor. I walked back upstairs to my spot in the hallway. I kicked the blue silk dress out of the way. It slid across the floor, useless and flimsy. I crouched down next to my canvas bag. I yanked the heavy brass zipper open and shoved my hand deep into the bottom, past the rolled-up socks and the faded green shirts. My fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. I pulled it out. Danny Brennan's lucky coin. It was jagged on one side, heavy copper and steel. I closed my eyes and breathed in. I could almost smell the burnt rubber, the diesel fuel, and the choking black smoke. I could see Danny, 19 years old, grinning with a mouth full of dust, telling a terrible joke right before the armored truck hit the mine. I sit here in the dark, gripping this piece of metal, holding onto the only real thing left in this house. Have you ever had to build your own family from scratch because the people who shared your blood were too broken to love you? Let me know in the comments. Just type yes if you understand exactly what it feels like to be completely alone in a crowded house. Hit that like button and subscribe because my real fight hasn't even started yet. I squeezed the metal coin until the jagged edge cut a sharp line into my palm. The pain was sharp, real. It grounded me. I leaned my head back against the drywall, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow the sun was going to come up. Tomorrow the music would start playing, and I was going to burn this fake plastic house right down to the studs. The dining room sounded like a cheap diner at the worst part of the morning rush. Silverware scraped hard against heavy porcelain plates. Loud, open-mouthed chewing mixed with the clinking of thick wine glasses. The air in the room was stifling thick with the smell of roasted beef, heavy garlic butter, and the stale beer someone had already spilled on the hallway rug. It was the pre-wedding lunch. The long mahogany table was packed shoulder to shoulder with aunts, uncles, and cousins. I was shoved at the absolute far end. The corner edge, it was the exact spot you usually save for a toddler who drops their peas on the floor. Evelyn hovered over the center of the table. She completely ignored my side of the room. She was too busy using a pair of silver tongs to drop another thick, bloody cut of prime rib onto Wes's plate. Wes sat there in a crisp designer polo, leaning back in his chair, soaking up the attention like a sponge. Uncle Richard sat to my left. He was a guy who flipped cheap residential properties, constantly bragging about his margins. He always smelled like cheap cigars and overpriced cologne. He chewed a piece of ice from his water glass. The wet, crunching sound grated right against my eardrums. "So," Richard said loudly, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He didn't look at me, just addressed the whole table. The chatter quieted down. "When are you going to give up this little phase and get a real job? Mila government salary isn't going to cover a mortgage in this economy. You can't live on taxpayer handouts forever." I didn't flinch. I didn't snap back. I looked down at my hands. I carefully placed my silver fork on the very edge of my plate. I aligned it perfectly parallel to the knife. I looked up and stared at Richard. Just a flat, dead stare. I looked at him the same way I would look at a rusted-out car blocking a dirt road. An obstacle, nothing more. He shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable, and took a quick, nervous sip of his drink. Aunt Susan jumped in to save him. Her voice dripped with that fake, sugary concern people use when they want to cut you deep. "She's 32, Richard." Susan sighed, shaking her head sadly. "Living in the dirt halfway across the world with all those men and still no ring on her finger. It's a shame. Look at Sloane." She gestured toward Wes with her wineglass. "Only 25 and she's already managing the Whitfield estate properties. She has a real future." Wes smirked. He picked up his glass, swirling the dark red liquid. "Let her be Aunt Susan. She's busy playing with boats and playing dress-up. Someone has to do it." Laughter rippled across the table. Ugly, mocking, herd-like laughter. The muscles in my jaw pulled tight until my teeth ached. A hot, heavy pressure built up behind my ribs. The urge to reach right across the roast beef, grab my brother by the collar of that expensive polo, and introduce his face to the mahogany wood was completely overwhelming. My hands twitched on my thighs. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. In. 2. 3. 4. Hold. 2. 3. 4. I forced my heart rate back down. I forced the boiling heat out of my blood. I sat perfectly straight, pressing my spine rigid against the back of the wooden chair. I let them laugh. Their ignorance was a thick, heavy shield. They had absolutely no idea what my hands had done to keep them safe, or what my eyes had seen so they could sit here drinking expensive wine. Through the noise, my eyes locked onto someone sitting directly across the table. Aunt Diane. She wasn't laughing. She was staring down at her plate. Her knuckles were bone white as she gripped a sweating glass of ice water. Her jaw was tight. She looked sick. Evelyn walked up right behind my chair. The heavy, suffocating scent of her floral perfume washed over me, completely masking the smell of the food. She reached over my shoulder without saying a single word. Her manicured fingers clamped down on the edge of my plate. I wasn't finished eating. Half a piece of beef and a pile of vegetables still sat there. "Too crowded down here," Evelyn muttered. "You don't need all this room." She pulled the plate away. She didn't offer me a smaller one. She just took my food and walked back toward the kitchen to make more space for Wes's empty wine bottles. I watched her walk away. Then I looked back across the table. Diane's head snapped up. She watched Evelyn take the plate, and a deep, angry frown cut across her face. Her eyes met mine. For a split second, the polite mask slipped. I saw it clearly. Pure, unadulterated disgust. Not at me, at them. Diane wasn't just sitting there. She was a massive crack in their foundation. I had absorbed enough. The stale air in the room was choking me. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs let out a harsh, sharp screech against the hardwood floor. The sound cut right through their laughter. The table went completely quiet again. I stood up. I didn't ask for permission to leave. I didn't say excuse me. I turned my back on the entire room and walked down the hall. I stepped into the guest bathroom and locked the heavy door behind me. The sudden silence was deafening. The bright, sterile light from the vanity bulb stung my eyes. The air in here was cold and smelled like bleached tiles. I turned on the faucet. I let the freezing water run over my scarred hands. I cupped the water and splashed it hard against my face. The icy shock pulled me back to reality. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, staring at my own reflection in the mirror. Water dripped from my chin. My jaw was locked solid. My eyes were cold. Buzz. I froze. The vibration came from the front pocket of my heavy canvas pants. Buzz. Buzz! I dried my hands on my thighs. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up the small, dim bathroom. One new text message. Sender Aunt Diane. I opened the message. There were no words, just an image, a cropped screenshot taken directly from an iMessage group chat. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the glowing blue and gray text bubbles. A drop of water fell off my chin and hit the cold floor. I read the first line of the screenshot. The air completely left my lungs. The bathroom was freezing. The thick granite counter pressed hard against my stomach. Water dripped from my chin, hitting the porcelain sink with a hollow tap. I held the phone in my scarred hand. The bright screen cut through the dim yellow vanity light. Aunt Diane didn't send a warning text. She didn't offer an apology. She just sent a screenshot. It was an iMessage group chat. The header at the top read, "Wedding Logistics." Right underneath that, in tiny gray font, it listed the group size. 14 members. 14 people in this house. Aunts, uncles, cousins, parents, the groom. I wasn't one of them. I zoomed in on the image. The bubbles were stark and clear. Evelyn had sent a long, frantic paragraph right at 11:40 a.m., just before I sat down at that dining table to eat with them. "Make sure no one encourages Mila to wear that green outfit tomorrow," Evelyn's text read. "The Whitfields are high-class people. They expect elegance. I am not letting her turn Wes's wedding into some cheap parade. She's sitting at table 9, right by the kitchen doors. Keep her out of the photos. Table 9, the overflow table. The place you stick the awkward cousins, the loud drunks, and the plus ones you don't want to see." She was treating me like a stain she needed to scrub out of the carpet before company arrived. Right beneath Evelyn's paragraph was a single gray bubble from Wes, sent at 11:41 a.m. Good. That was it. One word from the brother whose college debt I paid off. One word from the kid I used to carry on my back when he scraped his knee. I didn't cry. My chest didn't heave. A heavy numbing cold simply washed over my entire body, starting from the back of my neck and sinking all the way down to the soles of my heavy boots. I swiped my calloused thumb across the screen, pulling the image down to look at the very bottom of the chat. There was a tiny timestamp buried right under Wes's reply, a read receipt, read by Arthur at 11:42 a.m. I stopped breathing. The air in the bathroom felt like it had been sucked through a vacuum. Arthur. My dad, the man who had shuffled into the dark hallway last night in his expensive plaid robe. The man who had looked at me sitting on the bare floor and asked, "You sleeping all right out here, kid?" He played the clueless, tired old man so perfectly. But he knew. He read his wife's command to erase me, and he just slid his phone right back into his pocket. He sat at the head of the dining table today, chewing his prime rib, watching them tear me apart, and he kept his mouth shut. His silence was worse than her venom. He was the one holding the door open while she drove the knife into my spine. I stared at the top right corner of the phone screen. The little LTE symbol, 4 solid bars. I thought about my Visa bill from last Tuesday, $150. The automatic monthly payment for the AT&T family data plan. I paid for 4 lines, mine, Evelyn's, Arthur's, and Wes's. I spent the last 2 years eating out of plastic bags. I slept on canvas cots in places where the heat baked the moisture right out of your lungs. I hoarded every single dollar of my hazard pay, refusing to buy myself a decent cup of coffee, skipping meals just to make sure their bills were covered back home. And they used the data I paid for to build a private club just to humiliate me. It was a disgusting, pathetic joke. I was literally funding my own execution. The illusion snapped. The heavy, suffocating obligation I had carried for 32 years just evaporated into thin air. They weren't family. They were parasites. They were ticks buried deep under my skin, sucking the blood out of my life, complaining that I didn't bleed fast enough to keep them satisfied. I clicked the screen off. The bathroom went dark again. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The noise from the dining room hit me like a physical wave. The loud braying laughter of Uncle Richard, the clinking of heavy wine glasses, the sickening sweet tone of Aunt Susan's voice. They were still going, still chewing on my life while I paid for the roof over their heads and the phones in their pockets. I didn't walk back into the dining room. I didn't need to scream or flip a table. I was done trying to convince a room full of vultures that I was a person. I walked straight down the hallway toward my canvas duffel bag. The blue silk dress Evelyn had thrown at my head was still sitting on top of the bag, pooled together like a cheap puddle of water. I reached down and grabbed it. I didn't fold it. I just bunched the slick, cold fabric up in my fist. It felt flimsy, worthless. There was a tall stainless steel trash can sitting right next to the hallway closet. I walked over and stepped hard on the pedal. The metal lid popped open. The smell of old coffee grounds, sour milk, and wet paper towels drifted up from the plastic liner. I held my fist out and let go. I dropped the blue dress inside. It sank right to the bottom, landing in a crumpled heap on top of a greasy pizza box. I let my foot off the pedal. The heavy steel lid slammed shut with a sharp metallic crack that echoed down the quiet end of the hall. I turned back to my duffel bag. I grabbed the thick brass zipper and yanked it open. The metal teeth separated with a harsh ripping sound. I reached inside the dark canvas. It was time to get dressed. The house in Weston smelled like burnt hairspray and nervous sweat. I stood by the front door, gripping the heavy canvas strap of my duffel bag. Wes walked past the stairs, adjusting the stiff cuffs of his white shirt. He didn't look at my bag. "I'm taking an Uber to the hotel," I said. He stopped. His shoulders dropped a full inch. Pure relief washed over his face. He didn't ask what I was wearing. He didn't ask if I wanted to ride in the limousine with the rest of the family. "Yeah, good idea. See you there." He turned and walked into the kitchen. I stepped outside and let the heavy front door click shut behind me. 2 hours later, I walked into the grand ballroom of the hotel. It was completely empty. The catering staff was still rushing around with silver trays. The ceiling was covered in massive crystal chandeliers. The air was freezing, smelling like fresh linen and expensive roasted meat. I walked slowly past the head table. Gold-rimmed plates, massive towering arrangements of pale pink peonies. I kept walking, all the way to the back of the room. Table 9. It was shoved behind a thick, ugly concrete pillar. It sat right next to the heavy metal swinging doors of the hotel kitchen. Every time a busboy pushed those doors open, the harsh smell of industrial dish soap and old frying grease bled into the ballroom air. I looked down at the table setting. A cheap white folded cardboard card sat on top of the napkin. Mila Black? 2 L's. 32 years of sharing the exact same blood, and they still couldn't spell my name right on a piece of cardboard. It was a careless, lazy mistake. A final physical reminder of exactly how much space I occupied in their minds. 0. I didn't crush the card. I didn't rip it in half. I just dropped it right back onto the white cloth. The employee locker room was at the very end of a dark, narrow hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow onto the cheap linoleum floor. The room smelled heavily of damp mops and concentrated bleach. I set my bag down on a scratched wooden bench. I grabbed the heavy brass zipper and pulled. I reached deep inside the canvas and pulled out the dark, heavy wool. My dress blues. I stripped off my faded street clothes. The cold air of the locker room hit my bare skin, raising goosebumps on my arms. I picked up the dark trousers. The crease running down the front of the leg was sharp enough to cut glass. I pulled them on. I slipped my arms into the heavy wool jacket and fastened the buttons. The fabric was thick, stiff, unforgiving. It didn't allow for slouching. It forced my spine completely straight. It pulled my shoulders back and locked them into place. The weight of it settled over my chest, heavy and solid. It swallowed up the weakness, the rejection, and the quiet humiliation of the last 2 days. It replaced the unwanted daughter sitting on a hallway floor with a captain. I reached into the bag and pulled out the service cap. I placed it over my head. I brought my right hand up, pressing 2 knuckles right between my eyebrow and the stiff black brim. The exact, perfect measurement. I looked up into the smudged, dirty mirror above the sinks. The woman looking back at me didn't belong at a folding table next to a kitchen trash can. I reached into the side pocket of my bag and pulled out a small flat wooden box. I snapped the lid open. The metal inside caught the terrible fluorescent light. I took a small microfiber cloth and wiped the surface of the brass. The sharp chemical smell of polish filled the small space, cutting right through the bleach. I picked up the ribbons first. I lined them up on the left side of my chest, measuring the distance with my thumb. Then I reached back into the box. The purple heart. The heavy gold edges were ice cold against my calloused fingertips. Finally, the silver star. I held the small metal star in the palm of my hand. The second the metal touched my skin, the memory hit me. It wasn't a movie. It was just noise. The deafening, violent chopping sound of a rescue chopper slicing through thick, burning air. The heavy metallic smell of fresh blood soaking rapidly into dry dirt. The agonizing feeling of dragging 190 pounds of dead weight by the collar of a vest while the ground literally exploded behind my boots. Evelyn was sitting at a country club brunch that exact same day, complaining to her friends about the summer humidity. I held the star tight. I lined the thick metal pins up over the dark wool right above my heart. I pushed hard. The sharp points pierced the thick fabric. Click. The metal fasteners locked into place on the inside of the jacket. Sharp. Final. I ran my thumb over the silver surface one last time. I reached down and grabbed my black leather Oxfords. They were spit-shined, polished so hard they looked like black glass. I slid my feet into them and tied the laces tight. I stood perfectly still in the center of the locker room. My breathing slowed down. Deep, even pulls of air. Out in the hallway, the faint sound of a jazz band started tuning their instruments. The guests were arriving. Then another sound cut through the music. Clack, clack, clack. Sharp, frantic stiletto heels hitting the marble floor of the hallway, moving fast, stopping right outside the thin wooden door of the locker room. Mila. Evelyn's voice echoed off the hard tiles, high-pitched, breathless, deeply irritated. Mila, are you in there? The Whitfields are pulling up right now. Hand me that blue dress so I can iron the wrinkles out. I need it right now. I stood in the center of the room. The dark wool absorbed the sound of her voice. I didn't answer. I didn't make a single sound. I walked slowly toward the door. My polished shoes made zero noise on the linoleum. I stopped inches from the cheap wood. I raised my right hand. The thick scars on my knuckles stretched tight over the bone. I wrapped my fingers around the cold brass doorknob. I turned the cold brass knob and pulled the locker room door inward. Evelyn was standing right there, her knuckles raised, caught mid-knock. She wore a pale lavender gown, the neckline heavily encrusted with cheap, glittering beads that tried way too hard to look like diamonds. The overwhelming smell of her aerosol hairspray hit my nose instantly. It was sharp chemical and completely masked the lingering scent of floor bleach in the hallway. She looked at my face first, then her eyes dropped down to my chest. She saw the dark, heavy wool. She saw the silver star catching the terrible fluorescent light and the purple ribbon pinned directly over my heart. The color drained out of her face so fast she looked physically ill. The thick layer of foundation on her cheeks suddenly looked like a death mask. Her mouth opened, pulling her glossy pink lipstick apart, but no sound came out. For 3 full seconds, we just stood there. The quiet mechanical hum of the hallway air conditioner filled the space. Then the panic finally set in. Her survival instinct wasn't fight or flight. It was absolute, desperate control. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed. She kept her voice low, a frantic, vibrating whisper trapped in the back of her throat. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, terrified someone from the groom's party might be wandering the marble hallway. "Where is the blue silk? Take that off right now. You are not ruining your brother's wedding, wearing that absolute embarrassment." She didn't wait for an answer. She lunged forward, stepping right into my physical space. Her hand reached out her long acrylic nails, aiming straight for the lapel of my jacket, intending to literally drag the heavy wool off my shoulders and force me back into the room. I didn't think. I just reacted. My right hand shot up. I caught her wrist mid-air and shoved her arm down and away. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't violent. It was just a fast, heavy block. Bone hitting bone. A sharp slap of skin that echoed loudly off the cheap linoleum floor. Evelyn gasped, sucking in a sharp breath. She stumbled backward, the heavy beads on her dress clacking together like loose teeth. She caught her balance against the patterned hallway wall, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. She cradled her wrist against her chest, her fingers trembling. I didn't move an inch. I kept my feet planted on the floor, my back perfectly straight, my shoulders locked. "Pull your hand back, ma'am," I said. My voice was completely flat, barely above a whisper, but heavy enough to crush the air out of the hallway. "Do not touch this uniform." Her chest heaved. The rigid, perfect mother-of-the-groom mask was completely shattered. Her eyes darted wildly around the empty hall, searching for anyone to save her. She was losing her grip, and she knew it. So, she pivoted. She went straight for the guilt. "Mila, please," she begged, her voice, shaking, dripping with a fake, desperate sweetness that made my stomach turn. The Whitfields are incredibly polite people. They expect elegance. Just go back in there, put the dress on, and go sit at table 9. Stay out of the photos. Just do this one thing for your family. Please." I stared down at her. I looked at the deep wrinkles forming around her eyes, the nervous sweat pushing through her expensive makeup. "I read the texts, Evelyn," I said. Her mouth snapped shut. "I read the wedding logistics group chat," I continued. My words dropped like heavy stones onto the marble floor. "I know exactly what you typed at 11:40 this morning. I know you put me by the kitchen trash because you were afraid I'd ruin your aesthetic. And I know Arthur read it at 11:42. Evelyn froze. Her lungs just stopped working. The fake pleading sweetness evaporated from her eyes, replaced by pure, naked shock. She had no defense. The lies were gone. The manipulation was dead. She was standing there completely exposed, looking at a daughter who finally saw her for exactly what she was, a parasite. Have you ever had to look your own mother in the eye and realize she didn't actually love you? She just wanted to use you for her own image. It is a cold, suffocating feeling. If you know that exact pain, type yes down in the comments right now. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel because I promise you, I didn't back down. Down the hall, the heavy muffled sound of a cello bled through the walls. Pachelbel's canon in D, the processional music. The guests were seated, the show was starting. I reached up and adjusted the stiff collar of my jacket. I smoothed my calloused thumb over the edge of the silver star. I stepped out of the locker room, forcing Evelyn to press her back flat against the wallpaper to get out of my way. I didn't look at her again. I walked straight down the long, empty corridor toward the main ballroom. My heavy leather Oxfords hit the marble floor. Click, click, click. The sound was steady, relentless. Evelyn finally found her voice. "Mila!" She choked out her heels, scraping awkwardly against the floor as she tried to follow me. "Mila, stop! You are humiliating us." I didn't break my stride. I reached the end of the hall. The massive 12-foot-tall oak double doors stood right in front of me, separating the quiet hallway from 150 high society guests. "I am not the stain on this house," I said to the heavy wood. I raised both hands. I placed my scarred palms flat against the brass push plates. I took one final deep breath and I shoved the doors wide open. The heavy oak doors gave way under my hands. I pushed them wide open. The light inside the grand ballroom was blinding. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, throwing a warm golden glow over 150 people. It was a sea of pale pink mint green and champagne silk, expensive haircuts, tailored tuxedos. And then there was me. I stepped onto the polished hardwood floor. The dark, heavy wool of my uniform swallowed the light. I didn't hunch my shoulders. I didn't look down at my shoes. I kept my spine rigid, my chin pulled up, and my eyes locked straight ahead. The string quartet in the corner was still dragging their bows across the cellos, playing a slow, predictable wedding march. But the noise in the room started to die. It didn't happen all at once. It spread like a cold draft. Laughter cut off mid-sentence. The clinking of glasses stopped. Heads turned. Whispers hissed through the crowd as people stared at the dark, severe contrast standing at the entrance of their pastel party. Out of the corner of my eye, the heavy doors fluttered. Evelyn squeezed through the narrow gap. She hugged the patterned wallpaper, trying to blend into the shadows. Her face was chalk white under her thick makeup. She frantically waved her hand toward the front of the room, desperately trying to catch Wes's attention without making a scene. I didn't wait for her. I started walking. My leather Oxfords hit the wood floor. Click, 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 steady, measured, heavy. I looked toward the front of the room. The head table sat on a raised platform, completely smothered in those $1,000 peony arrangements. Wes was standing behind his chair. He was holding a crystal flute of champagne, throwing his head back, laughing at something his new father-in-law said. Then he saw me. The smile snapped right off his face. The color drained from his cheeks. His hand jerked violently. The expensive champagne sloshed over the rim of the glass, spilling down his wrist and dripping onto the pristine white tablecloth. He didn't even try to wipe it up. He just stared at me for a split second before his eyes darted away, staring desperately at the floor. He shrank into his expensive collar. Beside him sat Arthur. He had a piece of roasted meat halfway to his mouth. He caught the movement in the room and looked up. When he saw the black wool and the silver pinned to my chest, his hand went completely limp. Clatter. The heavy silver fork slipped through his fingers and hit his china plate. The sound was sharp. Ugly. Arthur didn't reach for it. He bowed his head, staring at his lap, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own cowardice. The mask was gone. The fake happy family was bleeding out right in front of the Whitfields. I kept walking. I passed table after table of luxury. Silver ice buckets sweating with condensation, plates piled high with lobster claws and thick cuts of beef. I smelled the rich garlic butter. I looked at the food, and I tasted dirt. I remembered sitting in a sweltering tent thousands of miles away, peeling back the foil on a packet of dry, tasteless food, pouring lukewarm water into a plastic pouch just to have a hot meal. I remembered the grit grinding between my teeth. I remembered hoarding every single paycheck, wiring it directly to Evelyn's bank account, so these strangers could sit here and eat off gold-rimmed plates. I didn't stop. I walked all the way to the back of the room, past the ice sculptures, past the sprawling gift table. I walked until I hit the ugly concrete pillar, right next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. Table 9. The air here was hot. It smelled like industrial dish soap and old frying grease. 6 people were already seated at the table, distant, awkward cousins who didn't make the cut for the good seats. They stared at me, their mouths slightly open in confusion. I looked down at the empty place setting. There it was. The cheap cardboard tent sitting on the napkin. Mila Black. I reached out with my scarred right hand. I didn't touch the card. I grabbed the thick wooden back of the dining chair. I didn't lift it. I dragged it. I pulled the chair straight back. The wooden legs scraped hard against the polished floor. It let out a loud, high-pitched shriek. The ugly sound sliced right through the soft cello music. It echoed off the high ceiling. I didn't sit down. I let go of the chair. I stood right behind it, my hands resting at my sides. I stood completely still, staring straight through the crowd, acting as a living monument to every lie they had told to get to this room. The ballroom was dead silent now. Even the string quartet finally stopped playing, the cellist resting his bow on his knee. At the very front of the room, at VIP Table 1, an old man sat in the center seat. Frank Holloway, the grandfather of the bride. He was in his late 70s, wearing a dark, heavy suit that smelled like old money and rigid tradition. He had a piece of bread in his hand. He stopped chewing. He didn't whisper to his wife. He didn't look at Wes. His pale blue eyes tracked the heavy silence in the room, bypassing the pastel dresses and the floral centerpieces. His gaze shot straight to the back corner. He locked onto the black wool. He squinted. The chandelier light caught the metal on my chest. Frank's eyes dropped to the left side of my jacket. He saw the ribbons. He saw the red, white, and blue stripe. He saw the silver star. Frank Holloway slowly lowered the piece of bread. He picked up his white linen napkin and dropped it onto his plate. He placed both hands flat on the edge of the table, and he pushed his chair back. Frank Holloway's chair scraped heavily against the platform. The sound cut right through the quiet ballroom. He didn't just stand up. He pushed himself upright with a sudden, rigid force that completely erased the slouch of a 70-year-old man. He stepped away from the table, away from his granddaughter's massive wedding cake, and turned his entire body to face the back of the room. He faced me. He squared his shoulders. He pulled his chin back, and then he opened his mouth. Silver star on deck. His voice wasn't just loud, it was a roar. A deep, heavy command that carried decades of authority bouncing off the high vaulted ceiling and crashing over the 150 people sitting in their silk dresses and tailored suits. It was a bark that demanded absolute obedience. No one moved. No one coughed. The guests froze in their seats. At the head table, Wes sat paralyzed, his jaw hanging open, completely clueless about what was happening. Evelyn, hovering somewhere near the middle of the room, looked around with wide, terrified eyes, assuming some sort of disaster was unfolding. They didn't understand the words, but someone else did. The command acted like a lit match dropped on dry brush. At table 3, a middle-aged man with graying temples abruptly shoved his chair back. He didn't say a word. He just stood up, dropping his hands straight to his sides. Over by the dark mahogany bar, 2 women in their late 50s put their crystal wine glasses down on the counter at the exact same time. They turned away from the bartender. They stood tall facing the back of the room. It spread through the ballroom. One by one, chairs scraped. Men in tuxedos, women in evening gowns. Uncles, business partners, family friends of the Whitfields. People who knew the heavy, brutal cost of the metal pinned above my heart. 12 people. 12 veterans hiding in plain sight among the high society crowd. They all stood up. They ignored the flowers, the champagne, and the confused whispers of their spouses. They locked their eyes on me. Frank Holloway didn't hesitate. He brought his right hand up in a sharp, crisp motion. The edge of his index finger stopped perfectly at his right eyebrow. A flawless, rigid salute. The 11 other people in the room mirrored him instantly. Arms snapping up, hands held tight. For 10 seconds, the entire room ceased to be a wedding. It became a sanctuary. A quiet, heavy space belonging entirely to people who understood dirt, blood, and loss. The 130 other guests, the millionaires, the real estate developers, my own family, they were instantly demoted. They became nothing more than background noise. Irrelevant spectators watching something they couldn't buy, fake, or steal. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I kept my breathing slow and even. I brought my right hand up, sharp, clean. I held the salute, returning the heavy respect they were giving me. I looked at Frank. He held my gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. He understood the scars you couldn't see. He saw the person my mother had spent her whole life trying to hide. I dropped my arm to my side. Frank dropped his. The others followed. The tension in the room finally broke, replaced by a loud, confused murmur as the guests started whispering frantically to each other. Suddenly, there was a frantic rustling of beaded fabric right next to me. Evelyn practically tripped over her own heels. She came rushing out of the crowd, a massive plastic smile plastered across her face. The panic was gone, instantly replaced by sickening, opportunistic greed. She saw the most powerful man in the room standing at attention for me, and she immediately decided to cash in on it. She stepped right into my personal space. She reached out and clamped both her hands around my left forearm. "Oh, we are just so incredibly proud of Mila," Evelyn announced loudly. She pitched her voice so the Whitfield tables could hear her. She squeezed my arm, trying to pull me closer to her side. "She has always made this family so proud. Her service is it's a blessing to us all." The words smelled like garbage. 4 hours ago, this uniform was a piece of trash she wanted hidden in the garage. Now it was a shiny accessory she could wear to impress her new in-laws. She was trying to steal the one thing she had never given me: honor. I didn't pull away immediately. I just turned my head and looked down at her. I looked at the heavy makeup caked into the lines around her mouth. I looked at the desperate, greedy shine in her eyes. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy made my skin crawl. I brought my right hand over. I didn't slap her away. I didn't raise my voice. I placed my calloused fingers over hers. One by one, I peeled her manicured fingers off my dark wool sleeve. I gripped her wrist, not hard enough to bruise, but tight enough to make her gasp. I pushed her hand down, forcing it back to her own side. I kept my voice low, just for her. "Don't you ever claim me again." I let go of her wrist. I reached inside the front pocket of my jacket, my fingers brushing against the cold, heavy copper edge of Danny Brennan's coin. I pulled my hand back, leaving Evelyn standing there with her arms hovering in the empty space between us. The smile on her face fractured. The silence in the ballroom was total. The clinking of silverware, the polite coughing, the shuffling of expensive leather shoes, everything had stopped. 150 people were staring directly at us. I didn't lower my voice. I didn't whisper to spare her feelings. I projected. I spoke from the chest, pushing the sound out so it carried past the ice sculptures, past the floral arrangements, and hit the heavy mahogany tables in the back row. "Proud," I said. The words sounded like glass breaking on a tile floor. Evelyn flinched. She took a quick, terrified step backward. Both of her hands flew up to cover her mouth, her eyes darting frantically toward the head table. She was looking for Arthur. She was begging her husband to stand up to pull rank to drag me out of the room before I could ruin her masterpiece. Arthur didn't move. He sat hunched over his gold-rimmed plate, his chin practically resting on his chest, staring at a half-eaten piece of beef. He was completely paralyzed by his own cowardice. I locked my eyes back on Evelyn. At 11:40 this morning, I said the words ringing out sharp and clear. You sent a text to the family group chat. You called this uniform a total embarrassment. You told everyone to make sure I stayed away from the cameras because you were terrified I would ruin Wes's wedding. A collective sharp intake of breath echoed from the tables closest to us. Evelyn's face crumpled. The heavy layer of foundation couldn't hide the dark, panicked flush crawling up her neck. You put me at table 9. I continued, pointing a calloused finger toward the ugly concrete pillar by the kitchen, right next to the garbage doors so the Whitfields wouldn't have to look at the poor trash who actually paid for those flowers on your table. Evelyn let out a small choking sob. She didn't try to defend herself. There was no defense. She just stood there, shrinking under the crushing weight of the silence, completely stripped of her fake high society armor. I turned away from her. She wasn't worth another second of my time. I looked past the pastel dresses and the shocked faces of my relatives. I looked directly at the 12 men and women still standing at attention, the veterans. I reached into the pocket of my dark wool jacket. I pulled out the heavy copper coin. I held it up. The metal caught the light from the massive crystal chandeliers above. I am not standing here today to ruin a party, I said. My voice was steady. It didn't shake. I am standing here for a 19-year-old kid named Danny Brennan. I am standing here for him and for 3 other people who didn't make it back so I could. I looked at Frank Holloway. The old man's jaw was set like granite. Their lives, I said, gripping the coin tight, are worth more than any piece of silk in this room, and I refuse to hide them just to protect anyone's fragile ego. I lowered my hand. The quiet in the room was suffocating, heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a car crash before the sirens start. Then there was movement at the head table. It wasn't Arthur. It wasn't Wes. Gerald Whitfield, the father of the bride, pushed his heavy oak chair back. He was a massive man, imposing, the kind of guy who ran boardrooms just by walking into them. He stepped down from the raised platform. He didn't look at Evelyn as he walked right past her trembling figure. He didn't even glance at Wes. He walked straight up to me. He stopped, squared his shoulders, and held out his right hand. I looked at his hand. Then I looked at his face. There was no pity in his eyes. There was only absolute, solid respect. I reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm, calloused. Captain Black, Gerald said, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent room. The Whitfield family is honored to have you here today. He let go of my hand, but he didn't step back. He turned his head slightly, his eyes sweeping over the cowering figures of my mother and brother. When he spoke again, the polite country club veneer was completely gone from his voice. It was replaced by a cold, hard disgust. If your family does not know how to treat you, Gerald said loud enough for every single guest to hear, then you are welcome to come sit at the head table with us. The words hit the room like a physical blow. It was the ultimate public execution. The man Evelyn had spent a year trying to impress the family, Wes had desperately tried to buy his way into, they had just openly, publicly rejected them. They looked at the fake polished facade of the Black family, found it disgusting, and threw it in the trash. Wes was completely frozen in his chair, his face the color of wet ash. Evelyn let out a loud, ugly sob, burying her face in her hands. The humiliation was absolute, total. I looked at Gerald Whitfield. I gave him a slow, tight nod of gratitude. Thank you, sir, I said softly. But today is Wes's day. I've done what I came to do. I didn't wait for his reply. I didn't look back at the head table. I didn't look at the woman crying into her hands. I turned around. My heavy leather Oxfords hit the hardwood floor. Click, click, click. The crowd silently parted, stepping back to create a wide, clear path for me. I walked straight toward the heavy oak double doors. I pushed them open, stepping out of the glaring light of the ballroom and into the quiet, empty hallway. The heavy doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the noise with a loud final thud. The heavy oak doors shut behind me. The heavy thud cut the ballroom off completely. The string quartet, the clinking glass, the suffocating smell of roasted meat and expensive perfume, all of it just stopped. The main lobby was empty. It smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. I walked straight to the coat check counter. The girl behind the desk didn't say a word. She just slid my faded canvas duffel bag across the polished wood. I grabbed the heavy strap and slung it over my shoulder. Mila, wait. The voice was breathless, shaky. I stopped and turned around. Arthur was jogging across the marble floor. His expensive suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie slightly crooked. He looked old, just a tired, hollow man. In his trembling right hand, he held a thick piece of folded parchment paper, the citation certificate for the medal. The piece of paper he had intentionally hidden away so Evelyn wouldn't have to look at it. He held it out to me. His hand was shaking. I was going to say something. He choked out, his eyes watering. In there, when Frank stood up, I was going to say something, I swear. I'm so sorry, kid. I looked at the piece of paper. I didn't reach for it. I kept my hands at my sides. Your silence at 11:42 this morning said everything I ever needed to know about you. Arthur, I said. The words were completely flat, void of any anger. You aren't apologizing to fix me. You're apologizing so you can sleep tonight. Keep the paper. I turned my back on him. I left him standing in the middle of the empty lobby, completely alone with his guilt. The automatic glass doors slid open. The freezing Massachusetts night air hit my face. It was sharp, clean. It instantly burned the smell of the hotel out of my lungs. A yellow cab was idling by the curb. The harsh metallic smell of exhaust fumes hung in the cold air. The engine hummed a low, steady vibration. Mila! The doors slid open again. Wes came running out into the cold. He didn't have his jacket on. His expensive white shirt was wrinkled, the sleeves pushed up. His face was blotchy, streaked with panicked, ugly tears. The arrogant smirk from the hallway was completely gone. He looked exactly like the terrified 12-year-old kid I used to pull out of fistfights. Mila, please, he sobbed, stopping a few feet away, shivering in the cold air. I'm sorry, I'm so stupid. I never even asked you what it was like out there. I never asked what you had to do. I reached out and grabbed the cold metal handle of the taxi door. I pulled it open. The yellow dome light flickered on, illuminating the worn black leather seat. I looked at my brother. I didn't hate him. I just didn't feel anything for him anymore. The cord was cut. Your regret is a heavy thing, Wes, I said quietly, but it belongs to you. Carry it yourself. Grow up. I tossed my heavy duffel bag onto the floorboard and slid into the back seat. I pulled the door shut. The heavy crack of the metal sealing me inside cut off the sound of his crying. I looked out the tinted window. Back near the entrance, hidden just behind the edge of the revolving glass doors, was Evelyn. She was standing in the shadows of the lobby. She was watching Wes cry on the sidewalk, but she refused to step outside. She was absolutely terrified that someone from the Whitfield family might walk out and see her standing in the cold, dealing with her broken family. Even now, with her son falling apart on the concrete, her image mattered more. I didn't roll the window down. I didn't look at her twice. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. The screen lit up my face. There was a new notification. Aunt Diane had manually added my number back into the wedding logistics group chat. I opened the message thread. I stared at the long list of names. Evelyn, Arthur, Wes, aunts, uncles, the parasites. My calloused thumbs hit the glass screen. I didn't type a paragraph. I typed exactly 2 sentences. The line is drawn. Do not look for me. I hit send. I didn't wait for the little gray bubbles to pop up. I tapped the top of the screen. I scrolled down to the bottom of the settings menu. I hit leave group. Then I went to my contacts. I went down the list. Evelyn, blocked. Arthur, blocked. Wes, blocked. Every single one of them. Erased. I locked the phone and dropped it into the pocket of my wool jacket. Airport, I said to the driver. The cab lurched forward, pulling away from the curb. The hotel, the ballroom, the crying brother on the sidewalk. They all shrank into the red glow of the taillights and disappeared into the dark. I reached up and pulled the stiff service cap off my head. I let it drop onto the seat next to me. I leaned my head back against the cold leather headrest and closed my eyes. I reached into my pocket. My fingers wrapped around the heavy copper edge of Danny's coin. I held it tight. For the first time in 32 years, my chest felt completely light. The suffocating weight was gone. I didn't have to hide anymore. I didn't have to buy my way into a family that despised me. I was heading back to the gates, back to the people who actually knew how to take a hit for the person standing next to them. I was finally going home. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video.